Welcome to the Yorkshire Leaders podcast. Today's guest is the head of business and features at the Yorkshire Post. Previously, he's been the paper's political editor and assistant features editor. Prior to that, he was senior reporter at the Sheffield Star newspaper, where he was twice named as Johnston Press's Journalist of the Year. He was also part of the original team that created the Johnston Press Investigations Unit, and he even covered the US election campaign for the newspaper in 2016. Travelling to Washington, D.C., Virginia and Michigan to report on stories around that monumental election, which you may remember was between none other than Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Listeners, please welcome Chris Byrne to the podcast. Hi there, Chris. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on. Really appreciate the invite.
It's a pleasure to see you, and it's great to meet you. This is our first meeting, so I'm really looking forward to getting into some nuts and bolts of what you do and what's going on at the Yorkshire Post and all about your leadership as well. So Chris, I just did a little intro there and mentioned that you did spend some time over in the States at a really interesting time, especially to be a journalist. How was that? Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
Yeah, so it was amazing, to be honest. It was probably, I've been really fortunate with my career, and it was probably the highlight still. At the time, the paper I worked for, the Sheffield Star, was part of the same newspaper group, Johnston Press as the and the Yorkshire Post. And I still don't 100% know how it came about, but myself and several other regional journalists from other titles, other groups, basically across the country, were given the opportunity, paid for by the US Embassy, to go out and cover the US election. I'd done a little bit of work for the before as part of the Johnston Press Investigations team, and they were quite interested in the coverage I could do, and also the Yorkshire Post were too, because the Yorkshire Post kind of has this kind of national, regional feel of trying to, well, it brands itself as Yorkshire's national newspaper, so global events were of more interest to it. So although I did do stories for the Star, I found a few people from South Yorkshire who were living out there to get their kind of take on the election, what their hopes and fears were for it. My work kind of gravitated towards being for the Yorkshire Post, and probably particularly the as kind of a person on the ground. And it was fascinating. We went to a rally by Trump, which was super memorable for lots of different reasons. Then the following day, we saw Obama speak. And I always say to people, it was totally different. I don't know how much was in my head, but the Trump rally was in this stadium. People were queuing up for hours to get in. It was dark. It was quite foreboding, really. He came out on stage. The US flag was like 100 foot at least behind him, and he had this baseball cap over his head, this really long trench coat on, and he was kind of like Lex Luthor or something walking out there. But it was really quite intense. And like, he was getting the crowd to shout abuse. The media pen was kind of in the middle, and he was getting the crowd to shout abuse at the media. And it was all this call and response from like almost like wrestling, which
Wow.
I've read subsequently is kind of like where he took a lot of his cues from. His speech cues was WWE. And then the next day we went to Obama's rally at like this college. Thousands of people there, couldn't have been more different. But do you know what? I remember everything that Trump said, and I couldn't really tell you anything that Obama said. One thing that I really took away from it as a journalist that I try never to forget is speaking to people at the Trump rally who, like, my personal view of Trump is not positive, I would say. But people at the Trump rally genuinely believed he was a good guy. They were the good guys. Hillary was awful and like a danger to the country. And the thing I took away from that is everyone believes they're the good guys, like everyone. And that's something I try and take that approach in my journalism. It's like in everyone's head, generally, they think they're doing the right thing, and everyone has a different perspective on the same reality. I'm not saying it's right or wrong, but I think it's always an important thing to bear in mind that people don't see themselves as like, people often do see the world in black and white, but often they're like the good ones and someone else is the bad ones. The reality is often more nuanced and complicated, but that was probably the biggest thing that I took away from that whole trip. One of the things that was really interesting was it was late October, early November, and we just had Brexit, right? Which was against what the commentators and against what even the markets to a certain extent expected to happen, the vote. We kind of met this parade of experts who would tell us the electoral maths is impossible for Trump to win. But then you spoke to people, even in Washington, people didn't like Hillary. Like in Washington, DC, people weren't bothered about Hillary. The thing that their whole electoral maths things didn't take account of is, what if loads of people just want to vote for Donald Trump and it upturns your model? And what if loads of people, the votes repressed because people aren't bothered about Hillary? Because she was basically running on, it was basically like continuity Obama, but without Obama. As Remain saw in the UK, it's a hard sell of like, everything's okay or all right, but the other thing's worse. That doesn't really get people powered up or fired up. And like,
and wasn't this the election where it was kind of, afterwards there was lots of investigation, still is, on about Facebook as well?
Yeah, do you know what? I personally take all of that with a pinch of salt. Because you could say it, I'm sure there was, I'm not saying it was Russia or whatever. I think from my perspective, sometimes you just have to say people like this guy, for better or worse. Like, look at the projections for 2024. Despite all these court cases, he's
despite
100% pretty much going to be the Republican nominee, and it seems quite likely that he's going to win. Well, that's what the polling says at the minute. Let's see. But sometimes you have to say, well, maybe it wasn't Putin changing everyone's minds. Maybe it was people like this guy, for better or worse. And he was really good at, he knew how to manipulate the media and knows how to manipulate people. That is, I know that like that is a skill of a politician to a certain extent that he had. Like, you can say whatever you want about his character, and most of it would probably be right.
You could say a lot.
Yeah, you could say a lot.
Yeah.
But he had a political skill set.
But that was such a great picture that you painted of the rallies and the size of the flag, and the kind of
I'll never ever forget it. It was
I bet.
It was a privilege to be there, really, and like to witness it unfold, even though it was very intense. It was very, very intense actually being there, but
and part of history as well.
Yeah, and at that point people kind of thought, oh, he's going to come close but he's not going to win, and it'll go back to being a joke basically. But people loved him.
Tell us about a day in your life now. You're not running around after Donald Trump.
No, you might not be quite as exciting.
Around after other people in the region. So tell us a bit about a day in the life of a journalist or editor.
Yeah, so we're probably quite unusual at the Yorkshire Post in the local media landscape. Well, we are even in the national media landscape, really, in that we still set a lot of store by the print products. We do obviously put a huge amount of effort into the website, the online stuff, which does come first in some ways, but part of my role is making sure the business pages are filled with good stuff, and also the features guys who do an amazing job cover like our magazine, which is a 100-page magazine on a Saturday. There's a feature page every day in the paper. There's property post section, there's fashion, there's all sorts. And to a greater or lesser extent, the job of my team revolves around the print product, but with the caveat that we're always looking to get stuff online first. But basically, a good story is a good story, and if it's a good interview, should hopefully work well online as well as in print. In terms of my team, we're still, to a certain extent, print is a big part of our day-to-day, I guess. So we will be looking in the mornings. I work closely with Deputy Features Editor Laura Reid and the Deputy Business Editor Greg, but also really the whole team, identifying, and the magazine editor Catherine Scott, to identify the stories that work for each section, make sure we're not clashing with anything the news guys are doing, and get the paper out. A lot, particularly on the features side and particularly on the magazine side, is like planning ahead. So for a magazine piece to work, it needs to be people-led, but most stories do need to be people-led. But to have someone who's willing to be photographed by one of our brilliant photographers, but also the photographs can't just be of the one thing. there has to be a spread of photos for it to work as a magazine piece. So you're thinking about that. You're thinking about, will this make a magazine cover? Is the story strong enough? Are the images strong enough? Does it clash with any of the other pieces we've got planned? All of those kind of things. Yeah, when it comes down to it, it's as simple as identifying good stories, interesting people to speak to, and writing them. From the start of my career, I started the Shropshire Star in 2010, 2011. And it already is, when I describe it to people, it already is kind of like a forgotten world. There were 7 daily editions that printed on the day for Shropshire, and the website was kind of not an afterthought, but it was very secondary. So you'd wait till the paper went out at 11 o'clock in the morning or whenever, and then they might pick out 1 or 2 stories to put online. It's totally flipped around now, really. But a good story is a good story, whatever the medium, really. And that's kind of the approach we try to take as best we can.
So true, so true. And I've been probably working with the media for about 23 years. Just in that time it's just changed massively. From, we've seen the whole digital transformation, and the fact that the Yorkshire Post still is going to print every day, it's just a fantastic achievement. And it's something that I think we should all be proud of as well.
It's hard to without getting the violins out. It's such a hard landscape. We're doing it with less and less people, to be blunt, every year.
I was going to ask that. Yes, yeah.
And I would say, I know I'm biased, I'd say the product for what we have staffing wise is still really good,
really
but
quality,
it's hard.
Yeah,
it's hard work,
especially when you say there's 100 pages in the magazine to fill.
Yeah.
You're looking for, like you say, quality content. I'd love to talk a bit more about sort of deadlines, because I think when I'm talking to clients, we talk about, we'll do some, I think you'd make a great story. I think we should do some local press on you. And I think people don't really understand that whole background to the deadline situation on a paper. So often you guys will come to us or go to PRs or contacts at businesses and say, can we get a comment, or can you provide a quote? We've got this story breaking. Give us some input, basically. And it gives people a great opportunity to give a quote or a comment. And they don't really understand, well, actually, that's going to press today in maybe an hour. So just give us a bit of indulge.
I would say, just as a general point, journalists are terrible for... they want the content for them like days/weeks in advance, and then they want a comment back in like an hour. We do genuinely, like, it's easier, bluntly, on features particularly, to give a good lead time to people.
Yeah, of course.
I've always tried, I'd like to think, to understand that you have to be realistic, and like when you're speaking to someone in the press office, they need to speak to someone above them who may not be available for whatever reason, and then they've got to get that comment signed off, and the person that has getting the comment signed off might need to speak to someone above them who might not want them to say it in exactly that way. All sorts of things go into a few sentences sometimes. Let's take business for example. Myself and Greg and the other business reporters probably generally start now around 8 o'clock each morning, and by 11, 12 o'clock we'll have pretty much identified, because the market's obviously open about 7, things come in, we'll have pretty much identified what we want to do for the following day, and if we haven't written it by that point, we'll be close to having done it. So I guess my advice would be, if you want something in the Yorkshire Post on a Wednesday, I'd embargo it for the Wednesday and I'd send it to us by like Monday afternoon. So it's got a good chance of being on the Tuesday news list and going in print that day and online. Like we can, and we often do. So let's just take today for an example. A lot of the stories that are in tomorrow's paper are online now. Like, as much as I say we're print focused, yeah, we're making sure we're filling every space, but unless it's like a really strong exclusive, we're not going to hold it back. It will just go online like as soon as we get it near enough and it's written. I'm talking there about a really simple press release. And then if we're talking about Jeremy Hunt, the Chancellor's visiting a business and your CEO is keen to speak to the Yorkshire Post about it, we probably need like a couple of weeks notice to make sure we can get a photographer there to check that we've got a reporter free, which we might not, and get someone there to kind of do the coverage. So things are on a bit more of or you've got the CEO or the MD of a big business is coming up to Yorkshire for whatever reason. They've got half an hour to have a chat with the Yorkshire Post. Can you do it? If someone's asking us that a day before they arrive, the answer's probably going to be no. We have to be ruthless with our time.
And I've had it, before, where it's totally, you're reliant on the news agenda of that day, aren't you? So you might have a photographer booked. You might think, as a company, or someone's coming from the Yorkshire Post, but you guys get a much bigger story that breaks that day, and then you just have to drop everything and cover that story.
So a big part of my job is kind of expectation management, to be honest, and say no lots. But
that's a skill in itself.
Yeah, which I hope I do okay at. Give us time. Don't be afraid to follow up. Like, I had a call this morning about a story from someone who was like, "Oh, we sent you over this embargo thing last week, but things can fall through the cracks. Have you seen it? It was a good story." So I flagged it to the news desk. That's fine to follow up. Sometimes when you get someone like following up 3 times about the same thing that's not relevant, you're like,
no, that's not going to make the story.
It's not going to work. Everyone's got a job to do. Don't take offense, but people getting in contact, you almost need to build in the lead time. It was interesting. I'd gone from being a news reporter to being on the features team at the Yorkshire Post, because the features job actually came out of the America thing. Basically, the features job came up and they'd seen what I'd done on America, and they said, "Oh, do you fancy going for it?" And I did. I went for it and got the job. And then you get into the kind of the features mindset of you're working like a week in advance and you've got plenty of time to get comment from people. And then doing the political editor job it took me a bit of time to get back into the mindset. Like, politicians will get back to you pretty quickly generally, and they kind of expect, because the world of Westminster and politics works on that instantaneous reaction to stuff, and stuff that's a big deal on Monday is kind of old news by Tuesday a lot of the time.
So apart from saying no a lot, I was going to say, what kind of leader are you?
So firstly, in journalism, I would say that I'm conscious that people end up in managerial positions more by chance than design often. And it's like, if you do well, you tend to get promoted, and the skill sets of being a journalist aren't necessarily the skill sets of being a manager. And I'm super conscious of that all the time. You never stop learning, basically. And I think that's definitely true of management. So when I was political editor, I line managed 2 people, and bluntly probably didn't do a very good job of it, because so busy. Politics is crazy. It starts at 6:00 in the morning and it just does not stop. Like, and it was Boris Johnson time, right? So well, yeah, but you'd put down the laptop at like 7, and then it'd be like, oh, there's some new Partygate stories come out, let's rewrite this, that, and the other. I came away from that like, I did okay at that, maybe, but it's a lot bigger team, and there's freelancers and all stuff that we have to deal with. And so we have like a daily meeting to keep in touch with people. But I guess my approach is based on trying to act with integrity, trying to act with consistency. I think the key thing is following through on what you're going to say, trying to resolve problems for people if you can, but then almost as well the expectation management side of things. There's only so much you can do. I'd like to think that on our team, it's a good working environment, and I think people, I hope, enjoy going to work. And there's a lot of stresses that come with the job. And I'm really lucky with my team that if I look at my team, basically everyone takes stress away from me because they're all brilliant. And I try as best I can to take stress away from them. When you've got a big team, there's always a personal situation that people have to deal with. Unexpected things happen in people's lives. And often work is kind of the one area where you can be like, well, we can't affect whatever situation's going on with you, but we can take basically one stress off your shoulder, which is work. I'm really lucky in my job in that you get to speak to loads of like amazing business people and leaders. And there was a guy I spoke to, Matt Stevenson from a chartered surveyor company that I can't remember the name of, annoyingly.
One of them.
But I can't remember exactly what it stands for.
Well, at least you've
RLB. Yeah, but he said he was talking about his approach, and I thought he
Mm.
said something that really stuck with me. He said that one of the best compliments he had was from one of his trainees saying, if you say no to Matt about something, if you disagree with what he says, he will take on board why you might have said it. And if someone says, oh, you might be wrong about that, he takes it on board. And I try to be like that, because I think it's not my way or the highway, and often people have better ideas than you. And
Yeah,
so,
absolutely. And I can
yeah,
imagine you're still in quite a creative profession as well. So somewhere where there's, it's important to put both sides of the story across, and there's always going to be challenges to
yeah,
what opinion goes in black and white. So I can imagine there's a lot of,
yeah.
collaboration
And
between the team.
really, a lot of it's like, what stories are we covering it? How are we covering it? What's the line? Like, I
Mm.
wouldn't tell the reporters what line to take with something. I might, if they ask for advice, I'd say, oh, I might do it this way, but I won't say, oh, this is the line, you've got to stick with that, because I don't think that's my place to do necessarily. Being open-minded as much as you can. It's hard in the post-COVID remote working world to do. So that's why I do set quite a lot of store by having like a team meeting every morning at 9:30, even if it's just for 10 minutes, or just so people feel in contact and can raise things. Just all being in the same place, you can often kind of iron out issues.
That's really helpful. And I think what I'm learning more about from the podcast is that collaboration and working with other people, and working with other great people, but also as a leader, being open to their suggestions, their personal situations, really does make your role into more of a leadership role, and just being that open-minded person who's curious to know what's going on in people's lives and how they might think that a story should go. And that's what's coming across in lots of the leaders that we talk to, is that kind of working with others to get the job done. That's where the effective leader comes in. So when have you obviously you mentioned you went through this incredible time in the States, obviously you've grown as a journalist doing those incredible stories, and being put under pressure in the media pit by the Donald Trump event. But is there any sort of times when you can think of where you might have failed, or something's gone wrong, or where you feel like you grew from it? Because we like to talk a bit about failure and success in
That's
this
so. Do
podcast.
you know what I was talking about? I went and gave a talk at Leeds Beckett to some journalism students last week. This topic came up. I'll be careful how I word this, but basically, yeah, I always try. I think you learn a lot more from your failures than you do from your successes as a journalist, and that's certainly true for me. So I'll give two examples. So I was looked into a story. This is quite recent. I looked into a story of this organisation where people were making series of allegations against somebody. In the end, spoke to about 10 or so people, and I was confident in what they were saying, but nobody would go on the record. And in the end, I spoke to our lawyers about it. There were documents, but no one was willing to share them because it would identify who they were, etc., etc. And in the end, like, our lawyers were like, "There's not enough here," and I'd put a lot of time and energy and effort into this story. I hope I hope all the way along I tried to manage expectations about how possible it was or otherwise to get over the line, but in the end it wasn't, and I was disappointed to start with, but I also came away being like, what could I have done different there? And I think probably I should have, because I was kind of like, oh, well, I'll speak to this other person, see what they say, see if it matches, and kind of ended up going down this, not rabbit hole necessarily, but going quite far down the path with it. Whereas what I probably should have said at the beginning was like, look, it's going to need people to go on the record, and it's going to need people to provide documents. And if you can't do either of those things, let's just call it now.
To make that choice sooner.
Yeah, which would have saved them time and stress, and me time and stress. So I learned a lot from that. And then on a slightly more boastful example of learning from your failings, Theresa May was coming into our office when she was Prime Minister, and they asked me to do the interview. I had 15 minutes with her, and I found it. Got a couple of lines out of her, but it was really tough going, to be honest. And she was very good at basically just answering straight back, answer the question with whatever the government's official position was, straight bat, so you didn't really get anywhere that you wouldn't
Yeah.
have got from like reading the manifesto or whatever. And I came out of it and I was like, we got like a couple of splashes out of it. One about her saying fracking would be good for Yorkshire, and another one about
I remember that story.
transport for the north. Well, maybe it wasn't such a failure
I
then.
do. I
But
remember that one.
transport for the north was the original splash. But I listened back to the tape and I was like, or the recording, the tape. I listened back and I was like, oh, how could I have done this better? And it was probably, there was two parts to it. So the first part was I should have researched it better. So I'd subsequent to her to doing the interview and asked this transport for the north thing, I'd seen that John Prescott had said like a week before, it was basically about, are you going to give Transport for the North more powers? And her answer in a roundabout way was no, effectively.
In about 5 paragraphs.
And right a splash of that. I struggled to kind of draw much out of it because the argument was like, should have the same powers as Transport for London, which has loads of powers, fundraising powers. And actually, as I came to write the story, I saw this quote from John Prescott from like a few weeks before, where he basically said, I'm paraphrasing, but Transport for the North is like a paper tiger. It can't do anything. The way the government set it up's useless, effectively.
Yeah,
I'd have to go back and double check, but he said something along those lines. Yeah. And I thought, do you know what? Rather than me just kind of say hypotheticals to her, if I'd have said your political opponent, I know he's not like a direct political opponent, but our political opponent, John Prescott, has said, Transport for the North is useless. What are you going to do about it? I'd probably got a better answer out of it and then a more interesting story. I took a lot away from that. And then when I then interviewed Boris, well, I say I interviewed, I had like I was part of like a regional scrum where they invite journalists to whatever he's doing, which in this case was looking at a factory in Goole, and you get one question each. And so the night before, I need to get this question right. And I went through, it was just after COVID, so they'd spent loads on furlough and everything. But in the Tory manifesto, it said they promised not to raise VAT or income tax over the lifetime of the Parliament. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to ask him about that. And he he didn't actually answer it. And I think I was the last one to, he kind of was like, oh, it's all a matter for Sunak because he's the Chancellor. That's a matter for Rishi. And I did kind of say, I was a bit nervous about it, but I was like, well, hang on, that hasn't answered it. And in the end, he did kind of mumble out, well, we stick with the promise. But I had to ask it 3 times effectively and came away with a really good line. It made a really good splash and it was picked up by some like nationals and stuff. Hopefully learn from that, put the research in from it. So yeah. So you've asked a question about failure and then I just boasted for ages.
Well, the whole thing is, I think the whole point of that question is that you are learning from it, and I want our listeners get it because everybody fails. I think the whole point is failure can be a good thing. So I don't think it's a problem that you've learned from it, dealt with it,
no,
and then show that example. I think that's really good.
And I think that's really important, particularly with like trainee reporters on our team, is try, whether it's asking for an interview, like the worst someone can say is no, don't want to do it, fine, or try these more complicated stories, and if it doesn't work, it doesn't work, but you've tried. Do you know what I mean? I don't think there's anything you do learn from these things, and you have, if you can be self-critical but not too overly critical, you can develop from that, I'd say.
And also I think that example of Boris as well, he didn't answer your question in the first place. He had to try and then try again and try in a different way.
My heart was proper racing when I did it because I could see his like advisors like giving me the daggers. It was quite funny actually because I came away from it, got in my car, and I was like, yes. And then drove back, and I totally missed my turn. And I had to go from miles on. But
from Goole to Hull and back.
Yeah, well, it was a bit like that. But
I've done that before. It was the Prime Minister. Do you know what I mean? It's like, don't be intimidated. People who are listening might be wanting to be leaders in the future or are leaders now, and it's like everyone gets a bit of imposter syndrome every now and again. So
I think you have to. It's easier said than done, but people are people, and it's in some ways, in a funny way, it's easier with a politician because they kind of expect the challenge. It's harder to do with like an ordinary person. I wouldn't be so rude to an ordinary person to be like, you've not answered my question. But
I guess it's all in the format though.
Yeah, it's the format.
Like you said,
right?
It was a scrum.
So I felt it was appropriate and professional at the time. Others may have a different opinion. But
and you have a job to do at the end of the day. If you could give your 21-year-old self some advice, what would you say to him?
That's a good question. I think probably have a bit more faith in yourself, because after I finished my journalism training, I kind of not panicked necessarily, but panicked a bit and took a job. Like the first job that came up was with this business to business website, which doing effectively SEO for companies who wanted to get up the Google rankings. They'd pay us and we'd write stories in inverted commas for their website. And it was, in some ways, it was good grounding for like meeting deadlines and turning around lots of copy, but it wasn't journalism. It wasn't what I wanted to do. And then sort of the people off the same course go on to work for national titles and all of this. And I thought, maybe I should have like held my nerve a bit longer. So yeah, maybe that.
I think it all adds up, doesn't it? So
yeah,
you probably need some of those digital skills now as well anyway. So
yeah, true.
We do like to ask, or it's a sort of recent question, but is there any coffee shop or restaurant that you absolutely would alwaise recommend, or like a place that you could find? Could be
That's
anywhere.
A good question. Well, do you know what? We live in Mosborough on the outskirts of Sheffield, and there's a nice coffee shop / I don't know what you call it, and it's a bar in the evening, but called the Craftworks, where I sometimes occasionally go to work if I'm working from home. That's really nice if people are ever in this neck of the woods.
What healthy or unhealthy habits do you have, Chris?
Well, I don't know whether it's healthy or unhealthy, but I play five-a-side football on a Monday in a league. I'm going to say, people take it very seriously. I take it very seriously, even though we're not very
What's
good.
the point playing if you don't take it seriously?
We're getting better. We're getting better. We've gone from bottom of the league, no hopers, to middle of the table, no hopers.
Awesome.
So we're getting there. But yeah, I find that really good, because it's just like half an hour, 45 minutes where you're really focused on the game, and life and work stresses over there. Do you know what I mean? In the corner.
You've got to hit the ball, not think about your deadline.
Normally like out of the field or whatever, but yeah, yeah.
Oh, that's great. That is a very healthy habit, and a healthy sense that you want to win as well. That's spoken by a really competitive person as well. So, and what would you like people to know? What would you like listeners to know if you just had one message you can leave them with?
Maybe a more general point, but I feel really privileged to do the job that I do. And there's a lot of, like any job, right? There's loads of things that come with it. But when you strip it down to its barest element, what are you trying to do? If you're trying to do journalism well, you're trying to tell people the truth. And that is a real privilege. I don't take it lightly. It's a privilege to be able to do a job where your job is to tell people the truth. And like, there's loads of external factors that go on around that, but just cut out the noise. That's what it's about. I'm really privileged to be able to do that, I guess.
That's awesome. What a great thing to end on.